Well, my name's Stuart Herbert. I'm here to talk about how to craft a talk. I can see 2 speaker badges already, so we want to know partly the answer to that. How about you two? Have you given talks before? Not as such, okay. Are you thinking about giving a talk at all? Possibly, okay. And for you 3, how many talks have you given? I'm afraid I don't know you at all, so. First one, okay. Many. Awesome, then I'm going to be learning from you during this. How about yourself?
But different context.
Okay. Well, I was expecting a bigger audience, so these slides were aimed at a larger audience, but there's 3 things I was going to recommend to everybody to learn from. To actually how to write slides, this book is something I recommend very highly. Stephen Coslin's book. For practicing talks, have you guys heard of Toastmasters? Yep. Okay, no. So Toastmasters is an organisation that you go to practice speaking at, and the other people there will coach you on it. It's a great place to learn, and it's a safe environment to learn. And for those based in the UK, I always suggest going and getting some training. I actually am a qualified teacher of adults, and anyone can get this qualification. It takes about 12 weeks to do on an evening. It's currently called Level 3 Award in Education and Training. When I did it, it was known as ETO1, which shows my age a bit. Enrolment, it's normally done through adult continuing education through a local council or local college, and prices can vary from about £70 to about £200, depending on where you are in the country and which provider you use. But you learn how to teach, it's awesome. I did that course 2009, I think it was, 2008, 2009. I'd already been teaching and speaking for a long time by then, and I learned a lot from it, really did. Yeah. Anyone can learn to talk. Even the people who aren't in the room can also learn to talk as well. So what I was going to do is go through the process of speaking and break it down to 3 phases: the concept phase, the construction phase, and the rehearsal phase. And then go through some miscellaneous bits and bobs at the end. Especially as it's a very small audience, please do ask questions. And if there's anything else we want to do, want to cover afterwards, please come and grab me outside. How's that sound? All right? So let's look at the process. And I'm going to talk a lot about models and structure for talks. Structure to hang everything in your talk off, and mental models to help guide you as to what goes into the talk and how to structure it. I'm a great believer that it helps if there's a structure to follow when you're writing a talk, and if you've got some models to guide your thinking. And this talk's all about sharing mine. And I want to emphasise that this is just the way I do it. I've been speaking since 1996, both as part of my job and in open source communities as well. But there are plenty of other people doing talks in very different ways, and their ways are just as valid as this. It breaks down into 3 phases. There's a concept phase, a construction phase, and a rehearsal phase, and we'll go through each of those in detail as we go through the talk. And what happens with rehearsal is you start to iterate and go back to construction and back to rehearsal and back to construction over and over as you polish your talk ready for presenting it. The process takes time. My own figure is about 20 hours to prep a new talk, but that goes through the roof if I've got to go away and do some research for it or create supporting materials. For example, I did a talk at PHP Yorkshire in April this year, and I had to create a supporting GitHub repository for that talk from scratch. And I had to clear my schedule for the whole week before that talk. I went up a week in advance and just locked myself away and spent the whole week, 50, 60 hours, just creating all those supporting material to go into the talk. Sounds like everyone here already knows this one. Don't leave it to the last minute. Especially if you're relying on something like Flickr for images, as their downtime's increasing, it seems, the further they get away from the Yahoo sale. But guess where my Thursday night went? swearing at Flickr for lack of images. So that's the process. And the first part of this is a concept phase. And the way I look at it is it's where I create the design criteria for the talk. It's where the talk is, the boundaries for it are set. Now, where do you start when you're writing a talk?
Normally with a conversation with the person who's running the event.
You're right. Okay.
What do you want to see?
All right.
So requirements.
Requirements. Okay. The audience. Okay. I'm not an invited speaker normally, so I'm normally submitting to call for papers and that sort of things. But I thought when I was writing this that I would be starting with outcomes. With my teaching hat on, I want people to go away and change what they do on Monday because they've seen the talk that I've done. But when I sat down and worked out, I realised what I really start with is motivations. What's my motivation? Why am I giving this talk? Because sometimes it's educating, sometimes it's advocacy, it's developer advocacy. These are two folks from the PHP community, which is I'm part of. Gary and Chris, who do outreach and advocacy. Some of my talks are sales talks. I'm trying to convince someone to buy my magic widget and not use a competitor's magic widget. I've got friends in the community who love to stand on a soapbox and preach to the crowd. That's what drives them for their talks. And sometimes you get people who are reacting to those soapbox talks and are responding. I'm doing a talk in Bristol a week on Wednesday, and it's very much a reaction to someone else's talk. But there's other motives as well. I've got a friend who talks because it allows him to travel the world. He couldn't afford to do it otherwise. So he submits talks that he thinks will get selected and be popular at conferences so that he can travel and see the world, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, that doesn't seem quite right. But the more I thought about it, I thought, well, who am I to judge, to be honest? Yeah? Are there any that I've missed? Any motivations for writing a talk that I've missed from yourselves?
To improve public speaking.
To improve public speaking. Okay, so for practice.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good one.
Putting yourself in there.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that. How about yourselves? For the talks, your talk yesterday, why did you do that talk?
Well, I guess part of it was I thought it would be kind of cool to come over here to be capable for it.
Okay.
So now I will admit that was part of it.
Okay. That's awesome.
Yeah, and then I think basically like for my talk was on coming up with ideas for doing like an open source project.
Yep.
Because that's like an issue that I had like personally, like with like I would try to figure out what this to work on, and I'd see like all this, everything was already basically done.
Uh-huh.
Or it seemed like so.
Yeah.
So basically, I was like, I figured that I tell people like how I like got over that and be able to like work on stuff even though there's already a ton of stuff already.
Cool. Awesome. And how about for yourself?
I'm often informing people
Yeah.
stuff that they either don't know or don't appreciate the particular relevance of. But I do a lot on social issues.
Okay. So that's a bit of advocacy and education, perhaps. Awesome. You mentioned the audience earlier as well. And for me, that's the other part of the motivations. The flip side of the coin is, why is the audience here? And while I was researching Flickr for images, completely by random, this one popped up. It's amazing what Flickr's search engine thinks is relevant to a search term. But this one was a happy find. A talk without an audience, as I'm finding out very much today, doesn't necessarily work. So it's important to think about why the audience might want to come to the talk and what they're trying to get out of it as well. And so that's the theory behind the concepts for me. But what I do with my concepts is I write them down, and they become my talk abstracts. And I've got a structure that I follow for most of my talk abstracts. I'm not promising that any of you who submit to call for papers or anything, I'm not promising this would work to get you submitted, but this is what I do. I'm starting off with the motivations, is trying to understand why the audience might want to come to the talk. And normally, they're looking to improve on the situation that they're in at the moment. They've got a problem or something's not right and they need some help. So I'm looking to find out what that might be. And this is what I submitted to Crystal for the talk I'm doing right now. The slides will be available online, and this is up on the Freenode website. And then I sit down and work out, what am I going to cover in the talk? What are the things I'm going to say? And I stick those down as well. And what I'm doing in my head is I'm imagining, what would I do if someone grabbed me outside with a problem and asked me how I would go about solving it? I'd sit down and I'd show them how I do it. I'd sit down and show them the process I work through and what's going on in my head whilst I'm following that process. So I write those things down as well. And then outcomes, I mentioned earlier, what's going to change? Because if after seeing this talk, especially those of you who have not done a lot of speaking, if I haven't changed anything, how you approach your first talk or your next talk, then the talk's been a waste of time from my point of view. So I write those down as well, hence the 3 things at the start that you can learn to improve. And the thing with concepts as talk abstracts is they're created and published normally well in advance. It can be months between a call for papers closing and you actually giving the talk if you're speaking at conferences. And that has an important consequence, which means the concept is immutable once you've published it. However, sometimes you get it wrong. I've been speaking since 1996. I still sometimes come up with a talk abstract, and when I write the talk, I realise the talk needs to be something different. And at that point, you've got to reach out to people and say, hey, this has got to change. That talk won't work. You've got to do it. Don't surprise people in the room on the day. I'm a great believer in the rule of no surprises. Even a nice surprise isn't necessarily a good surprise. So that's the concept phase, is working out these things before I write any slides. So I've got my design constraints for the talk. Does that sound reasonable, everybody, so far? How does that compare with your own processes? Do you go through something similar? You may not actually write it down like I do, but maybe mentally you're doing some sort of similar modelling. Very much so. The presentation for me is the next phase. This is the construction phase, is where I create the talk itself and any supporting material. I mentioned earlier the talk I did in April where I had to create a GitHub repository for that. Those sorts of things. What do people need when they leave the talk in order to act on what you've shown them? And again, structures and models, very much so. So I'm going to go through some of the structures I use, and I'm going to put a lot of time into one of the key models I use to help guide this design. Now, first thing I do is chuck ideas into a mind map. This, for me, is the reason I own an iPad, is mind mapping. They're great for consuming stuff, but for creating, mind maps is what I do. And then I go for a walk. I find that a lot of the ideas I come up with are not when I'm sat in front of a device. It's when I'm doing other things. Driving is a weird one for me. Walking as well. When the brain's digesting in the background and is occupied with other things, that's, for me, is when ideas pop out. Sat in front of a computer, for me, is the worst place in the world to solve a problem or spot a pattern in a set of ideas I've thrown down. But this slide doubles as well, because I've chosen stepping stones deliberately. The way I look at a talk is, I'm already over somewhere. I'm trying to find the important points to point out to people so they can come over here as well, without getting their feet wet. That's what I'm trying to do. And the key thing I'm looking for is I'm looking for a starting thread. Eventually something will, in the mind map or in all the other ideas I've had, something will pop out and say, that's the key thing. If I start with that and pull on it, the whole talk will start to fall into place. And for me, it was the process. which was almost the last thing I put into the mind map. I put lots of other things in first of all. It was built quite bottom up, lots of small detail. And then as I looked at that and started to pull patterns out of it, I then started to realise, well, what is the high level process that needs to be done? And it's only when I found that starting thread, that key thread, that's when I go to my presentation software and start creating slides. Now, I'm not going to talk about writing slides themselves, and I'm not going to talk about presentation software. I'm going to refer to you to this book or equivalents. It's for PowerPoint, but it's written in response to death by PowerPoint. And the principles apply to any software, presentation software at all. I don't care what you use, or even like this morning keynote, if you don't use any slides. Whatever works for you. But what I do want to talk about is the answer to this question, because when I reached out to my followers on Twitter and they asked, what do you want to know about presentations? Because I'm doing this talk because I was asked to talk about creating talks by my audience. This was the question that came back loud and clear, is dealing with different ability levels in the same room at the same time. See, in a workshop or a classroom environment, there's different ways you can do that. You can have multiple instructors, and so you can have people go at different speeds. You can have people who are better at something help other people in the room as well, and then they can learn by teaching as well, you see. But in a talk, you haven't got those options. You've got to make it work in one go. And the first thing I do, there's a couple of techniques. The first thing I do, I borrowed from salespeople. How many of you have done sales or pre-sales, or familiar with how it works? So, okay. So a common concept there is the sales funnel, and the idea that salespeople are pre-qualifying the people they want to deal with in order to make sure they're spending more time on the sales that are going to close. And we can do the same thing here with a talk. We can put information out there so the audience can make an informed decision and pre-qualify themselves as to whether they're going to get anything out of the talk or not. I'd rather talk to 6 people who are interested than 20 people who aren't, to be honest. So what I do is any required prior knowledge, I stick it in the talk abstract. And then I make sure I mention it again at the start of the talk in the intro, so that gives people an opportunity, especially in larger venues. They can get up and leave if they want. And there's nothing wrong with that. If they're in a talk that's not going to work for them, let them leave. No one's a prisoner. I will try and cover as much of the prior knowledge as possible in a talk, but you've got to be careful with that. There's a balance. Cover too much and you lose your audience that you've worked so hard to pitch to. But you can make a talk work on several levels to a point. Adult education, learn how to teach adults. This will teach you that all the time. But I'm going to cover a couple of things from this adult course that I did. And they have 2 key concepts that they teach you in that course. The first one's inclusion. It's trying to include everybody who's in the room. So that's why at the start of a talk, I've asked you questions. I imagine it's why a lot of other speakers ask questions as well. The more I know about you and your interest in my talk, it helps me how I pitch it. So I'm interested in the experience you're bringing into the room. Plus it's an opportunity for me to learn from people like yourselves as well. And I'm interested in the experience they want to take from the room as well. Now, obviously I'm writing those question slides before the talk starts. Once the talk starts, I can't edit the slides. So I have to anticipate what those answers might be. And in teaching, we call it, I'm trying to remember the right phrase. We call it often the unasked question. When you're teaching a student, sometimes they'll come to you with a question, sometimes they won't. But normally, there's another question that they need to ask that they may not know they need to ask. And part of learning to teach is learning to anticipate what these questions might be and have answers and supporting material prepared for them. And that's what this skill is all about. And the other thing we can do, I can change what I focus on during the talk. I can change how I present each slide. I can change which slides get emphasis and which ones don't. Normally, in a larger audience, when people are saying their things are after, I'll be saying to them, I have a slide for that. And it's a technique I use very deliberately, because now they're looking out for that, they're listening for that, because they feel there's a connection been made. They feel that you've written a talk for them. And that means that they're more engaged, they're more switched on, and they're going to take more on board than if they're sat at the back feeling that they're just in the room. And I find for inclusion, simply helping people to listen is a big part of helping people feel included. And the second part's differentiation. And this is where I want to look at the model of learning. Does anyone know or have a model that they use for how people learn? And I don't mean visual versus all the other stuff whose names I've forgotten, I should remember. But do you know what the stages of learning are? No?
Isn't there like a trough of disillusion?
I should have looked for that one. I really should have. Mine is more boring, I'm afraid.
Okay.
There's 3 steps. The first one's instruction, where you tell people, do step 1, do step 2, do step 3, and you'll get a guaranteed result at the end. Then it's coaching, and that's where you're helping people come up with their own steps and transfer skills to new scenarios. And then finally you've got collaboration, where people have started to master something and they can come up with steps from scratch. And what you find is different people are at different points of this simple model for any given task. And the same person can be at a different point for 2 different tasks as well. Now, when you're dealing with this model and applying it to a mixed ability group, you've got to keep in mind that some people need instructions. They need to be told, do this. For example, with the concept, that 3-stage process of working out what the motivations are, what I'm going to talk about and what the outcomes are going to be, and writing it down. That's the instruction. Explaining why it works as well is also in there. And going into detail with that. And if you do that in your talks, different people will get enough from it. They won't get all of it, but the people who need instruction will get that, and the people who know those bits or have their own process that already works for them, talking about the why will help them look again at their own process and start to ask questions about it. Now, how do you make a talk stick? How am I going to help make this memorable for you for when you leave? Do you think about this? No? Okay. I'm not trying to call you out or anything. I've not knowingly seen your talk, so it depends. Okay.
Depends. I mean, you can either make sure you conclude in the right way.
Okay.
To leave so that kind of short-term memory.
Right. Okay.
Or to have some recurring theme.
Okay. So you're talking there is using the structure to build repetition up, so that it triggers the short-term memory. That's a good one. How about yourself?
It varies. I'm often talking about stuff that matters emotionally.
Okay.
So you've got
Yep.
at some level. So the important thing is to help them connect some sort of cognitive
Yeah.
sort of framework that will help them when they need it
Yes.
to be able to operate differently at the relevant points.
Okay. Ditto. This is a statue of Bruce Lee. How many of you have seen Enter the Dragon? Okay. So at the very start of it, there's a sequence where Bruce Lee is teaching a student. And he was very insistent on that going in there so the Western world could see how he teaches. That was an actual lesson that he recreated for film. And there's a key line in that. And it's something that came up again in my teacher training, and it's something I found certainly works for me with my talks, is it's emotion that triggers memory retention. The structure and everything else, the repetition you said, is also important, and it's something I should have had a slide on. No 2 ways about that. Emotional content is a great way for people to remember, and also to trigger change as well. Facts and figures, especially in this country as we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months, sadly don't cause positive change. but emotion can. And that's as political as I'm getting today. The other thing I'd say is we want to avoid this. We want to avoid people falling asleep in the audience. This is hard because sometimes the venue's working against you. I've been in venues where very dim lighting and very dim projectors causing a lot of eye strain, which causes a lot of fatigue. And especially if it's the first talk after lunch, people have carved up at lunchtime, they are fighting the urge to fall asleep regardless of what you're doing. I mean, some nods from the back there. It sounds like you two have been in talks like that. So the other thing I'm doing with when I'm modelling a talk is making sure there's audience engagements like we've been doing today. I normally speak at user groups, smaller groups rather than large conferences. And the audience engagement can take an hour. A talk that takes 40 to 50 minutes to run through in prep to 2 hours plus. So you've got to be careful with it. Make sure you know how long the venue is available for if you're doing that kind of thing. But yeah, that's what I do when I'm constructing. It's brainstorming and organising the thoughts to find that key thread before I write any slides. I find I write a better talk if I hold off writing the slides until I'm happy and until it feels good. Every time I've started with the slides, the talk's been garbage, for me personally. That learning model, apply that when you're thinking about what content to put in, how to make the content play on multiple levels, so that you're appealing to as much of the audience as possible. Another point is the order that you do the what and the why doesn't actually matter. You'll find the right order for your topic. Sometimes the why works better first, and sometimes the what works better first. It depends on the topic. So don't get stuck into always must be what and then followed by why. Because sometimes the questions that tease out the why can be more engaging, and then the what you show people how you apply it. So you can do both. And then make it stick. The emotional content. I am going to cheat and edit this slide before I upload it and stick in the structure, because it's too important to be missing. It's too important to be missing. And the audience participation as well. So there's a two-way thing going, and you're helping the audience fight that urge to fall asleep. Now, partway through writing my slides, I move on to rehearsal. I probably spend as much time in rehearsal as I do writing my slides myself. Now, rehearsal is where I'm practicing my talk. But I don't just practice it once. I practice it as many times as I can, or until I run out of rehearsal time. I'm also not very good at just fitting a talk, the prep for a talk, into a specific period of time. I will steal as much time as I can get, quite happily. And I will go right up until I can't rehearse anymore. So, those of you who do rehearsal, why is it important to rehearse? What do you get out of it? Now, I think we can sum all those up to say that rehearsal's about debugging a talk. I'm trying to use software analogies as it's sort of a software conference. And for those of you who don't do a lot of speaking or are looking to start speaking, the skill you're looking to do is to present whilst listening to what you're saying simultaneously. You have to develop this internal observer as you're presenting and practicing. And the moment your internal observer picks up something that isn't right, you go back to construction, you fix it, and you go back into that iteration loop over and over. Now, something I found surprising. I wasn't expecting this outcome, but I noticed that the quotation slides that have been coming up, most of those were written actually during rehearsal. As I was actually speaking through my slides, trying to find those words, that rhythm, and trying to find the shorter words, the more impactful approach, that was where the quotations came from. So this slide here, whoop, there we go, that one there, that was one of the last slides I wrote. I never come up with those kind of things during the construction phase. It's only when I'm rehearsing that I find those things, that way to summarize what I'm trying to say. And the questions as well come out, and that's very much about the rhythm and the flow of it. It's about finding those spots where a question would fit without interrupting the rest of the talk. Now, I'm a great believer, and certainly it's my own approach, that during construction, I'm using my head mostly. I'm thinking about the content to go in there. I'm thinking about how to put it across to the audience. But during rehearsal, I actually switch modes, for lack of a better description, and it's more about feeling. It's more about how the talk feels as I'm practicing it. And this is another quote that I came up with that I think certainly applies to my approach. Construct with the head, but rehearse with the heart. And we mentioned flow very much. And that's one of the things I'm looking for. I'm looking for how it feels as I'm talking, because it should flow smoothly. It doesn't mean it's got to be on an even keel. Sometimes you want to build up to a crescendo, to a conclusion, and then start again through different sections of the talk. But when I'm practicing a talk, I'm looking for things like this. Is it hard going? Is it bumpy? Is it just horrible? Feels horrible underfoot? Does it take forever to get to a point, or does it not get to a point? And dead ends. And this comes back to your earlier point about using structure as well. Talks that just a section ends abruptly and it doesn't flow into the next section of the talk, for example, or a talk that just stops halfway through and doesn't feel like it's reached a conclusion at all. I'm looking out for those things when I'm practicing a talk, and if I feel that any of those are there, it's back to construction every single time for me. I always fix them. Another thing I'm feeling for is what I want to say and the way I want to say it wise. Or is it going to get me in the public stocks? Now, sometimes that's a valid thing to do. Sometimes picking a fight is a valid thing to do, but you've got to be careful with it. You may be representing a larger organization or a project. It's very rare we get to talk entirely about ourselves representing nobody else. And you've got to think about what you say and how it's going to reflect on that parent organization as well. And again, if I feel like any of these are going to happen, it's back to construction. Another movie quote. Don't know if anyone knows the movie this one's from. My head's full of silly knowledge, I'm sorry. But it's a little thing that works for me. If I feel any sort of doubt whatsoever, I don't try and intellectually override it, I try and fix it. Because it's an emotional feeling, and we're looking for emotion to connect with the audience in order for the audience to retain it. So I always do that. Now, you mentioned timekeeping earlier. Oh, it was Ronin.
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
Right.
Pop culture maybe, but you can steal wisdom from everywhere. Except me, I have none. Sorry, timekeeping. Yep. How long does it take to run through the talk? As you rightly said, a talk presented is very different to a talk read on a screen. But the other thing is knowing how long the talk slot is. We've had talks this weekend overrun for various reasons. I've been at other conferences where talks have run over, and it has an impact on everybody else. It has an impact on the audience, not just in that talk, but for the rest of the day. It has an impact on the other presenters as well. Some of them are forced to cut down a talk that they may already be struggling to fit into a slot. It's just something you should know. That's part of the professionalism of talking. Because you're allocated time. That's another design constraint. Normally with call for papers, they'll tell you how long your talk slot is, and if they don't, ask. Always ask. And if they don't, you can't get an answer. I've never seen that situation. So now, when I first wrote this talk, it was too long, and I had to start cutting stuff out. I'm really just scratching the surface of how to build a talk. And what I'm looking at is, first of all, how can I hit the time slot? The time slot is more important than anything else. It doesn't matter how important the content is. If it doesn't fit in the time slot, I may not even get to it on my slides before I'm kicked out of the room. And when you get to the end of the time slot, your audience is getting fidgety. They know it's time to go. And also 40 to 50 minutes after that, the audience needs a break. They're starting to get fatigued. But the other thing is, and this comes back to Paul's earlier point, some content in there actually it doesn't need to be there. You can find a shorter way to say it, a clearer, a more impactful way to say it. You can cut it out. So can you find that sort of stuff as well? And we're getting close to the end. Oh, yes, please. So move it into the supporting material. Yeah, that's an excellent point. That is an excellent point. I wish I thought of that. So 2 ways I've seen that done. First of all, stick all the code up on a GitHub repo. And secondly, stick a QR code on the screen and tell everybody who's interested, scan the QR code so you can go to the repo and find out. If they've got to type anything in, it will never happen. But a QR code, especially at a software conference, most people either will have a QR code scanner already or will be happy to download one there and then and use it if they're interested. Those are 2 things I've seen work. The challenge you've got there is how many do you make and take to the conference? You're either going to make too few or too many. And I think giving people the ability to go and get it for themselves, those who are motivated are going to go get it, and everybody else, you've saved printing out some stuff. That's my own feeling. But tell you what, why don't you try it and let us all know? Yeah? Let's put it to the test and find out, because it's just my thought. I mean, when I'm teaching in a classroom, there's always written notes, because in a classroom scenario, you write out a syllabus and you give the students either the syllabus itself or something based on that same structure. For me, it's not optional as a teacher in a classroom scenario. But otherwise, in a talk, I think you've just got to give people the opportunity. Now, we've got people coming in, and we did start late, so we do have a little bit of time left. So, did you mind holding the door for everybody else? Because we did start late. Sure. Thank you very much. We're coming towards the end now. When's a talk done? I mean, we've touched on this several times earlier. When it's time to present. I mean, the single thing for me is, it's when you stop editing. It's that simple. You may be forced to stop editing because it's time to present, or you may actually feel you've reached the point where it's done and you can send it off to the printers if it's a teaching syllabus or something like that. But that's the point it's done, is when you stop. And that's the only point it's done. Now, where to rehearse? How many people rehearse in their offices? I've done that, but it can be hard. If you're in an open plan office and you don't have a lot of meeting rooms, grabbing a meeting room for an hour or 2 just to practice a talk can be difficult. So if you're going to talk, be prepared to practice at home a lot. But also, user groups. I'm part of the PHP user community. I'm not a contributor to PHP, I'm just someone who talks about it. Paul at the back there is a contributor to PHP. You can talk to him if you want to about contributing to PHP, but I just talk about it. And we have user groups all around the world, and most of those will accept new speakers to come along and practice a talk for a conference. They openly invite people to do that. Now, I don't know the communities you're part of, but hopefully there's a user group network that you can tap into if you need it for that sort of opportunity. If not, do what we did, create the community. 2004, when I first started talking about PHP, there was none of this. This has all been built up, one chapter at a time. I mentioned Toastmasters earlier. This is an organisation that exists for you to go and practice your public speaking and get coaching and feedback. They'll be on meetup.com most likely. Go there and practice. Is there anywhere else you practice that I've not mentioned that's relevant? Nope. Where you're sleeping? Practicing your sleep. Okay. Well, if that works for you. Cool. So that's the rehearsal stage. And more than anything else, rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. I have given talks with zero rehearsal because I've been talking since '96. I can get away with it if I feel I have to. But my talks are always much better if I rehearse. Now, very quickly, I just want to run through a couple of miscellaneous things. They're not related to the structure of a talk at all, but a couple of things that popped up as I was preparing this that I wanted to share with everybody. First one is spread the love. Drop names, call people out, acknowledge them. I mentioned Gary and Chris earlier. There were slides on other people as well that I've had to take out for time. But especially in the open source community and the free software community, many of us are not paid for the work we do on free and open source software. Many of us are having to make a living off it in order to pay for our time to contribute to it. And mentioning people's names might be the only recognition and reward they get from it. And in the day of recruiters asking for GitHub repos and things like that, it's very, very valuable to people. So please, if you're using someone's work in a talk, mention it. If you get the opportunity to mention someone's work in a talk, please do. You're giving them a helping hand to where you are. Mentioned about writing talks and giving the same talk more than once earlier. My friend and mentor Lorenzo, another PHP community member, he has a saying that if something's difficult, you're not doing enough of it. Do it more to practice it. So one thing I do is I never give a talk more than once. You're the only people who will ever see this talk presented live. I always write a new talk all the time. Now what I get out of that is practice. I get better, hopefully, at writing talks. But it also means my audience is always getting a new experience. So there's 3 things to take away again. Recommend this book for learning how to design slides and what to put in them. I think it's an excellent book. There are others, of course, but this is my favourite. If you need somewhere to rehearse and you want to get practice and coaching, go to Toastmasters. That's what they do. That's all they do. And if you're in the UK, there'll be equivalent courses, I'm sure, elsewhere around the world. Get a teaching qualification. This has helped me so much, and my fellow speakers in the PHP community will know that whenever they sit down with me at a conference, I'm always bitching at them about this. Go and get some proper training on how to teach. It really does help, especially if you're a semi-pro speaker. You spend a lot of your time speaking. So what do you think? Does it make sense? Is there stuff there you can take away and digest and maybe help you? Anything in there you disagree with? Anything that's particularly egregious or stands out as something that wouldn't necessarily work for you? Or because I'm looking to learn as well. This is just my approach. And it doesn't mean I've got the definitive article, anything but. Comfortable on stage, yes, remember you're there on merit. More than anything else. That is your stage, it's yours. You're there because you deserve to be there. It doesn't matter what anyone else says, anyone else feels. That stage is yours for that time slot and nobody else's. And you've just got to own it. That's the #1 advice I can give. And if you don't feel that, pretend you do. Fake it till you make it. The way we think about something can transform the way we do something. It can be very powerful. So if you're here speaking and you imagine you own that stage, you may not be feeling it, but imagine that you do. And just try to own it and see what happens. And just give it time. You'll see lots of books written around the concept of the theatre of the mind theatre. It's prevalent in sales cultures a lot, but you also find it in meditation and in martial arts a lot as well. If you're looking for other areas, we can go and get more information on that. But the core of it is you're there on merit. No one can take that away from you. It doesn't matter how well the talk goes, that's irrelevant. You've earned the right to do that talk. Whether it goes good or bad is a consequence of being on the stage. But you're there on merit. I think it's important to be yourself. So if I try and put too much humour in here, it's fake and it comes across as fake because I'm not very good at humour. I'm not a very funny person. So I'm looking for more impactful images. See, the Lego image, no one laughed at that at all that I had up earlier. And that was my attempt at humour. It didn't work. So I should have picked something else to do with structures and models that was more me. Okay? But be yourself more than anything else. People respond to, well, some people respond to honesty and openness the most. Some people respond to hearing what they want to hear. You can't help those. They've decided what they're taking out the room before they've come into the room. You're merely the means to justify their own agenda, so you can't help those people. But the people who are coming to learn, be yourself and let them connect with who you are and what you believe in.